Hello, I'm Tim and I have too many books. So, we're midway through July and one of the booktube events for July is Jane Austen July. This is an event hosted by Katie from Books and Things, Marisa from Blatantly Bookish, and Claudia from Spinsters Library. Although all you really have to do in Jane Austen July is to read lots of Jane Austen, the hosts have put together a series of prompts to help you along with your reading journey. The first prompt is to read one of the main 6 novels. Now, the group read this year is Emma, but for reasons that will become clear later, I chose to read Sense and Sensibility, or at least reread Sense and Sensibility because I've read it quite a few times before. This reread of Sense and Sensibility gave me a greater appreciation of the novel. It's not usually one of my favourites. My favourites are Persuasion and Pride and Prejudice, as you might expect, but certainly it's going to creep up there. Also, I rewatched the BBC's 2008 adaptation of Sense and Sensibility while I was rereading Sense and Sensibility, not exactly at the same time, but certainly I felt that each enhanced the other. That Sense and Sensibility adaptation by Andrew Davies in 2008 is possibly my favourite Jane Austen adaptation. The next prompt is for another work by Jane Austen, and for this I chose a small play that she wrote, just 20 pages long, an adaptation of possibly one of her favourite books, Sir Charles Grandison. This is a bit of a chonker. It's about 1,600 pages, this edition. It's an epistolary novel, so there's an awful lot of repetition and often bits where nothing actually happens. I'm about 200 pages in at the moment, and yes, it's not exactly a struggle, but it is a task, shall we say. Jane Austen's play, which I haven't quite read yet, apparently just gives you sort of the exciting bits from the book. The next book is for a piece of non-fiction by or about Jane Austen. And for this I've picked What Matters in Jane Austen by John Mullan. I have read this book before, but on rereading it this time, I did realise that John Mullan is able to express in greater depth and clarity sort of half-formed ideas that I personally have about Jane Austen. In fact, so much so that if you want to know about what I think of Jane Austen, you should probably read John Mullan first and then come back to me and we can discuss the bits where I might not entirely agree with him. The next prompt is for a retelling or historical fiction based on Jane Austen. For this prompt I'm going to cheat a little bit and talk about a couple of works by John Coates. One is his 1958 continuation of The Watsons, in which he strangely changes the name of the heroine from Emma Watson to Emily Watson. Other than the name change, he seems to follow the outline that Jane Austen proposed for the completion of the novel. The other book by John Coates I want to talk about is Here Today from 1948. This is a science fiction novel, a time-travelling novel, in which a time traveller goes back in time to various periods in history. One of the periods in history he goes back to is the early 1800s, where he pitches woo to a certain Jane Austen. It's going to be very difficult to get hold of a copy of this book, so I'm left wondering whether or not John Coates sets him up to be Jane Austen's Sidmouth boyfriend. Of course, when I adapted the Drake equation to try to work out who Jane Austen's Sidmouth boyfriend was in one of my videos, I didn't factor in a time traveller. I might have to rethink it. The next prompt is for a work from Austen's Time, and I've chosen Jane West's A Gossip Story from 1796. This is a tale told by the rather wonderfully named Prudencia Homespun. It is a story of 2 sisters, one of romantic sensibility named Marianne, and the other embodying common sense, whose name, as you might expect, is Louisa. Given that Jane Austen started writing Eleanor and Marianne, which later became Sense and Sensibility, in 1797, people have seen A Gossip Story as a possible inspiration for that book. I'm not sure I'd go quite that far, although other people have seen much more of Jane West's work in Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. But we do know that Jane Austen read Jane West and occasionally talked about her in her letters. What reading A Gossip's Tale did for me is confirm that Jane Austen is something of a writer outside of her time. Jane West's book is very, very conventional for the time in which it is written. And while there's nothing wrong with The Gossip Story in itself, it does feel like a lot of other books published at the time, while Jane Austen's simply doesn't. There's just something about the way that Jane Austen approaches story and the way that she just tells stories and makes characterizations, which is modern and flows wonderfully. And it really highlighted how good Sense and Sensibility is compared to the Gossip Story. That said, A Gossip Story is a very, very well worth reading. The next prompt is for a direct screen adaptation, and as I almost always do, I am going to suggest the 1980 version of Pride and Prejudice, adapted by Fay Weldon. The reason I have for doing this is not that this is the best version. If you want the best adaptation of Pride and Prejudice for television, it's almost certainly Andrew Davies's 1995 version. The 1980 version does look very stagey compared to the 1995 version, and one or two of the cast are a bit stiff. However, I do think in Moray Watson and Priscilla Morgan we have the best Mr. and Mrs. Bennet ever put on screen. I really enjoyed Judy Parfitt's Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and Malcolm Rennie's Mr. Collins, well, I think he walks off the page. While this adaptation is perhaps not the best, it is much more book accurate than the 1995 version. This is both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because, well, it's book accurate, and it's a curse because Fay Weldon doesn't really go beyond the book an awful lot. And the reason this is something of a problem is that there are times when Jane Austen doesn't tell you absolutely everything that's going on. In Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen often summarises important conversations, important pieces of dialogue. And really, if we think about it, we would much rather see Jane Austen tackle those difficult and significant times in the book. Also, you can make the argument that Mr. Darcy is, somewhat underwritten. We don't really get to his motivation. This is something that in 1995, Andrew Davies specifically wished to tackle, which is, of course, a very good thing in many ways and makes for a very good adaptation. But of course, it does leave us with the legacy of a damp Darcy. We had a flooded Firth, we had a moist McFadden, and with this new adaptation in the works, we're probably going to get a liquid Loudon. The last prompt is for a modern retelling of a Jane Austen story, and for this, I searched around for something out of the ordinary, and I found a 1985 Indian television series called Trishna. This was a 13-half-hour episode series broadcast by the Indian state broadcaster Doordarshan. And although it is modernised and in Hindi, you always know where you are with it. By modern standards, the production values are not really up to snuff, but it certainly is charming. The characterizations are good enough that, as I said, you always know where you are. You always know who's speaking, even if you're not entirely sure what they're saying. But you do know what they're saying because you know Pride and Prejudice. You know what scene you're in, and you know the discussion. And the characterizations by the actors really sort of pull you through. For all its production flaws and scrappiness, it is still charming. The story comes through. So that's my Jane Austen July for 2025. I hope you enjoy your Jane Austen July, and I hope that you look into some of the things that I've suggested. Goodbye.